Hello and welcome to My Dog Will Eat My Face. Episode whatever. I've stopped counting. Well, today I just wanted to share an interesting conversation I had actually with my hospice nurse, of all people. Through the course of our conversation, I'm not sure how it came up, but she indicated to me how am I feeling emotionally with respect to knowing that I am dying, even though my condition can get a little bit better, and then it'll get worse again, might get better again, but at the end of the day, we all die. Anyway, you could say this about anyone, honestly. So to me, it's nothing very special or unique, not in the least. But she asked, how do I overcome that stress and those fears? And I explained to her that I changed my entire worldview over time, basing it on some thoughts that I had early on that I assumed were my own, as though I were the first to ever formulate these thoughts. And I then found that they were actually, in many ways, central to the philosophy and Stoicism. And as I've digged further into that philosophy, I have actually found a lot of solace and peace and a sense of calm and really no fear with respect to my mortality at any time it may which come. So she grew curious and asked what those thoughts were, and she asked some interesting questions. The two questions she asked were, am I religious? And am I spiritual? Now, I answered no right away to both of those. But I got to thinking, why would someone say Stoicism is spiritual? And found that there are many trains of thought out there, actually, that say that Stoicism is not exclusive of spirituality. And that really surprised me, so I dug into it. In this podcast, I'm just going to share my exploration and my findings and see if I can actually answer that question. Now, as I get started here down this journey, I will also share, I'm going to try to keep this podcast relatively short, just because I've been feeling excessively fatigued lately, and it really belabors me a lot to do so much of pretty much anything that is taxing towards me physically or cognitively. So I'm going to try to not exercise too much strength that I may have to explore this question. So I don't know if I'll even get there, but I'll try. Anyway, so of course, the nurse, asked those two questions, which at face value I said a blatant no. I think the fact that I'm an atheist is nothing new to anyone. It's hardly interesting at all to me. I don't really talk about it that much. It just does nothing for me, and I think, frankly, religion has long since lost the battle for many, many years, and there's absolutely no sense in believing that there is some sort of deity or creator or anything that would resemble a god by human definitions. So that's easy, done. I can answer that, and that's still my answer. And you could disagree with me, and that's fine. You're allowed to be wrong. Sorry. But it was really odd to me when she asked if I was spiritual. And I really quickly said no to that too, because in my experience, people use that word as just filler. They don't want to actively practice any sort of religion, going to a church or a temple or mosque or anything else. They don't want to abide by rules that are cumbersome to them, perhaps. And they just kind of fill it in with this vague spiritual thing that they say they are, which, when you ask them what does that exactly mean, I rarely ever get an answer. And in point of fact, my nurse said herself, she doesn't even know what spiritualism means before I had the chance to say it. So she would agree, and it's just such a broad term. And I thought about it, and I said I'd describe it as meditative, maybe. That might not be the right description either, because it's certainly not any art of clearing the mind or calming the mind in any sense. It's quite the opposite. So that is probably not true. I said it's definitely self-reflective, and that's true. But what would any of that have to do with Stoicism? When Stoicism is actually a philosophy that strongly hinges on materialism, that is, believes in the material world, logic, and a sense of what you can or cannot control. In fact, the Stoics for many years said things very similar to what we now call today the Lord's Prayer. It's said in every AA meeting you go to at the end, where they ask God for the wisdom and to know what they can fix and to fix it, and what they can't fix and just be aware of it. Something like that. But essentially, yeah, it's to be aware of what you can't change, and to only focus on things that you do have power over and change in those things, and not to dwell on those things which are unchangeable. So that's come from actually Stoicism for many centuries. It goes all the way back to the Greeks. So, all that being said, I struggle to see how that, in any sense, is a spirituality. So I decided to go ahead and go back to grade school and say, you know what, I'm going to look up what spiritualism means in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. It'd probably be better if I used actually Oxford for this. But, oh well, anyway. I just went to the Merriam-Webster dictionary and looked up spiritualism. And only a few things came up, actually. One, the view that spirit is a prime element of reality. Or two, a belief that spirits of the dead communicate with the living, usually through a medium. So, number two, I've always been aware of. That was very popular at the end of World War I in America, where you had people doing seances and things like that to talk to the dead. It's about the same time the Ouija board was popularized as a board game, but it all comes back to right after the Great War, when so many people had died in such a mass scale that we, as a species, have never really experienced before. So with this widespread grief, grifters found a way to make a token or two and offer up ways to communicate with the dead. Again, sometimes spiritualism is delivered through seances, and that's what they called it, was spiritualism. That was the name applied to it. And that's all true, and I think that's all hogwash. So I'm going to strike off the number two definition and go back to the number one. And it just says, the view that spirit is a prime element of reality. And when I read that, I still don't have a clue what that means. Because now I'm going to have to ask, well, what the hell's spirit? I mean, spirit has many different meanings, I think. And in this context, I'm not sure what it is. So I click on spirit. Tell me what a spirit is. Obviously, this can go all over the place. But basically, I got an animating or vital principle held to give life to physical organisms. That's obviously not true in any manner whatsoever. We know how, well, I guess we don't know how life began, but we have some theories, and we know how it's replicated and evolved. So I don't think I can rely on number one as the definition here. Number two, a supernatural being or essence. And based off me being an atheist, no. Drop that. Three, the immaterial, intelligent, or sentient part of a person. Okay, I don't think that applies here. And you know what, there were some other definitions that popped up that just don't really roll at all with this context whatsoever. For example, a spirit can also be an alcoholic beverage. Now that's a religion I could get behind. But, I really just kind of ran through them all, and to save time, there was one definition, the only one that kind of raised my eyebrow. And that was, I'm trying to scroll through here, ergo the slow pause, my apologies. Because it's a pretty vague. Hold on here. I'm scrolling through it. Bear with me, folks. I'm so sorry. I do a lot of these recordings impromptu, and this is proof. My ineptitude is proof that these are not scripted. Anyway, the one that I found that raised my eyebrow a bit, I'll cut to, is the activating or essential principle influencing a person. And also, I guess another one that was rather similar, a special attitude or frame of mind. A frame of mind. So, that definition, or I guess there's technically two definitions there, that sort of conformed to the context in which spiritual is being applied here in the first place. But you can tell from the wide arrangement of these definitions in the dictionary, it is a really odd word that can have things that mean totally different things. I think that's partly why it got put in as a sort of filler for people that don't know how to describe how they feel or what they go by. It doesn't mean anything. It might just mean that they're reflective and they have morals, and they just fill it in with, well, I'm a spiritual person. Okay, whatever. But those two definitions that I found are interesting. The activating or essential principle influencing a person or a special attitude or frame of mind. A frame of mind. If you apply that to Stoicism itself, it is a spirit by this definition, I think. It certainly is an attitude or frame of mind, and it's certainly an essential principle, or it's filled with essential principles influencing a person. So, based off just that meaning, I was rather gum-struck surprised that, in a sense, yeah, Stoicism can be spiritual. And there were some other Stoics on the topic that have penned examples of Stoicism's spirituality, and they claim that the sense of oneself interconnectivity to the rest of the world and the universe is what qualifies Stoicism as a spiritual thing. It's definitely not a religion. Everything agrees on that, but it's definitely a spiritual thing. And I guess I could kind of see what they're trying to say there. I think it's a rather rough push to argue that Stoicism is spiritual, but if you just go to the dictionary and you hit these two definitions, it's pretty simple. That apparently, yes, Stoicism is spiritual. So, I guess it is. And you can hear that I'm surprised and begrudged to say that. And I've already mentioned why, but let me get into that a little bit more. Now, the reason why I am so begrudged to even say that Stoicism is spiritual, or to say I'm spiritual, is exactly what I've already said. I've used it so often as filler that has no meaning whatsoever. And I've kind of inherited this angst with the word usage today from my favorite author on this topic, more or less, on deism and reality. And that is the belated Christopher Hitchens. I've seen him in many debates on Intelligence Squared and elsewhere, and every single time he's asked somebody to define what spiritualism means, they get tongue-tied and pretty much say it can mean anything. If it can mean anything, then it means nothing. And that's the problem. If this word has such a wide, appropriate, scare quote, I'm using scare quotes around that, appropriate usage, and such a variance to go from a frame of mind to belief in spirits and ghosts and things like that, that it literally could mean so much. I mean, I won't be exaggerating when there was about a good 15 definitions when I looked it up. And those were the two that I just hacked it down to that came close. And I think that when you have a word having so many meanings, it doesn't really mean anything. So that's why I don't like the word still, albeit apparently, according to the dictionary, it applies in this case, or could apply in this case, to Stoicism. It's just such a meaningless word if you can have so many definitions for the word with such a variation. You're starting to lose the meaning entirely. And so I'm still going to reject it. Even though Merriam-Webster is saying, oh yeah, based off these definitions, spiritualism can be applied to describe Stoicism, I still reject it because it's such a broad statement and such a broad word usage acceptable word usage I'm saying here, not just people pulling stuff out of their butt on the street, where they come up with whatever they think it means. I'm saying this is just what the variance that it's accepted in the dictionary. With that being such a variance, it's a dirty word. I can't think of a better way to describe it. It's literally, to me, a dirty word because it can have so many meanings and be applied in so many ways that it's been wilted down to having basically no meaning whatsoever. And even though you could argue it from Merriam-Webster, I think the broadness of the definitions in the dictionary itself is indicia that it's actually a meaningless word because it has such that intense variation. So I think my answer is no. Stoicism is not spiritual. No, I am not a spiritual person. Because that is a dirty word. It's a filthy, filthy word, and I don't want it used. And maybe at one time it had a useful meaning, of course. But it's grown to such a variation, I just think it's useless when describing anything. It's just not an appropriate word. It's dirty. It's been all over town. I don't want to use it. I don't want to sit on it. I don't want to touch it. That is filthy. It's a filthy word. So that's, I think, my final answer to the question I pose. To, is Stoicism spiritual? And am I spiritual? I think the answer is still no. So that leads me to wonder, how would I describe myself, or how would I describe my exploration of these deep matters that I've done for many years now, honestly, in this podcast, that have changed my position on life. And it's, in essence, you can't unring a bell. That's a saying many people hear. You can't undo the past and what's been done. There is nothing of sufficient force in this universe to change what's been done. You can do something to mitigate it or to expand on it, whatever it is, but that thing still had occurred, and that is now forever going to exist in this universe. So in a way, I think every single one of us have a bit of immortality in ourselves. Because everything we do in our life, no matter how minute we think it is something that you have altered and changed and taken action upon within this universe and cannot be ever undone. Everything you do will last forever. Just because you're long since dead and no one remembers what you did doesn't mean you didn't do it. Doesn't mean that it had no meaning. You most certainly affected the lives of many people in your life. And that effect on them will last forever. Even if the relationship goes south later. And sure, eventually, you go through the generations and no one knows who you are, what you did. But there were a lot of people who did know you and what you did. And you can never change what you do in this universe. You have influenced it in some way. Perhaps ways that are unfathomable to you. Something like the butterfly effect, which is the old notion of a butterfly flapping its wings in the rainforest could cause the largest hurricane in history to appear in Texas. These minute occurrences cause changes in the universe that are probably unpredictable. But as you go through each individual change, everything you do influenced it in some way. Everything you do matters. And I think that's why having your life and living it and not relying on an afterlife is so important. If you're miserable now, you will always have been miserable. But you can choose to try to address that and overcome those things. And then that will be completely undoable. So what you say, what you do matters, no matter how small. And so, what is Stoicism? I think it is something that, well, certainly it's a philosophy. You could say I'm philosophical in a sense. And it is very self-reflective to where you build up certain perceptions in your mind that drive your morality and your views about life and death and the universe. And that self-reflection is certainly something. I guess I don't know what you call that. Actually, it might be simple. Self-awareness. That matters. That's what matters. And Stoicism is just a way. As I'm certain there were many ways to get to that point of being self-aware. But I'm going to try this action for the first time in my podcast history. Now, if you are on anything other than Spotify, I apologize. It won't work for you. But if you listen to this podcast on Spotify, there is an actual way in which I can interact with my audience, ask them a question, and read their responses. So I'm going to try to use that today on this podcast and ask, what do you think Stoicism is? And do you think spirituality has any use as a definition of anything at this point? And is there a better word that should be used to describe what Stoicism is and what I am? I'm sure my friends can all populate this with colorful language. So if anyone does that, please don't do that. It'll be censored by it'll be censored by Spotify, but that kind of bums me out because that totally cracked me up. So I'm going to try that. And if you're on Spotify, you can answer that question and share your thoughts. First time I've ever used this feature, so I can't tell you much more than that, how it works. It should appear somewhere on the podcast screen if you're on Spotify, where you can interact with the person who's doing the podcast. Beyond that, I don't know. Try it. If it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. Oh well. Yeah, I'd love to know what others think. But I think I'm going to rest my arguments there at this point. Well, with all that being said, I'm going to wrap this week's podcast. I'll be curious to know if the listener interaction thingamajig, whatever it's called, actually worked and how it works. So, if any of you on Spotify can at least try that and see if it's successful, then just let me know. Well, I should know automatically if you respond to it, so we'll see. But if you are on Spotify, I'd suggest you try to at least use it just to at least let me know it's working. And we might use it later on for other interaction, which might be fun. So we'll see. Just an experiment. And I thank you deeply again for listening to this podcast and you lending me your ear for my incessant ramblings of a madman. I appreciate it. If you made it this far in the podcast, wow, you're a true trooper. And I thank you deeply from the bottom of my heart for your support. If you really want to support the podcast, don't forget to follow it and turn on notifications. And you can also go to the podcast's webpage on Spotify and support the podcast with a small numeric value, and just drop a coin in the tip jar, I guess, for me if you feel inclined. Or go to patreon.com/mydogwilleeatmyface. You can also show your support there if you're so inclined. But truly, you've already given me a lot for listening to this all the way through. I sincerely mean it and deeply thank all of you who give me a little bit of time and allow me to speak my mind to the world. But with that, auf Wiedersehen.